We're thrilled to be joined in this episode by one of our amazing adopters, Raun. With over 15 years of experience as a SENDCO and senior school teacher, Raun brings a wealth of insight from both an educational and personal perspective. After stepping away from teaching to adopt, Raun returned to work in education, this time supporting families by writing EHCPs and working with a local authority. In this conversation, Lisa, Jason and Raun dive into what the role of a SENDCO really involves, how families can seek help from schools, what reasonable adjustments look like in practice, and the ins and outs of education, health and care plans. You'll also hear practical tips for navigating the EHCP process and working collaboratively with your child's school.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Raun. I was wondering if you'd like to start us off by telling us a little bit about your professional experience.
Hi, yes, thank you for inviting me. So I've been a SENDCO, a Special Educational Needs Coordinator in secondary schools, for nearly 15 years. I quit being a SENDCO so I could have time to adopt because the hours didn't match taking on an adoptive child. And I moved into writing EHC plans and working for a local authority. Prior to being a SENDCO, I was a secondary school teacher, specialising in chemistry. And yeah, I've worked in secondary schools, big secondary schools, and I've also worked in special needs schools, specialising in autistic children.
That's an amazing kind of like diverse experience set there, and it's also really nice that you've got experience of perhaps working as a SENDCO and applying for EHCPs, and now being in a local authority and kind of writing them, kind of seeing it from both sides of the fence. But I think I'm going to have to ask you, what is the role of a SENDCO? Because we talk about them a lot, and I always know which questions to direct to them. But what does a SENDCO do?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. You usually try and keep everything together. I can remember the best description of a SENDCO, which I think it goes in a bit to what you're saying here, which was, no matter how tidy you are, in your kitchen, you've got a drawer for everything that doesn't fit. In a school, that's a SENDCO. Okay, everything that's just not normal. The role of the SENDCO is to make sure that the SEN children have got a voice in the planning and the organisation and running of a school, and that their needs are considered. It's also got legal duties to make sure that the needs of those children are met as well as the school can. And sometimes those legal duties are individual to a child's needs. So if they have an EHCP plan, the provision in that plan is a legal duty that school has to meet. Other times it's a more general legal duty of making sure that reasonable adjustments are there and that a school is not disadvantaging a child unnecessarily. Just when small changes, etc., can happen. They tend to have a lot of communication with parents.
Yeah.
And get a lot of difficult questions.
I can imagine
Absolutely.
it. And probably Jason and I might be guilty of encouraging our parents who listen to this to go and ask those difficult questions of the SENDCO. Forgive my ignorance here, but can any teacher be a SENDCO? Can they just decide one day there's a SENDCO position, I'm going to apply for it and just start? Or is there some kind of training qualification that you need to do?
In the past, it was the school needed a SENDCO and they could just assign anyone to it. Nowadays, in the past 15 years, you've had to have a qualification, a National SENDCO Award. A lot of listeners may be surprised to know that the SENDCO is the only job in a school where you legally have to be a qualified teacher. You legally need to have qualified teaching status. No one else in the school legally has to have that.
That's quite surprising.
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? But the new government has actually decided that's not going to be the case any longer. It's going to make everyone has to be a qualified teacher, which is interesting. I bet parents would be shocked if they thought, hang on a minute.
You can have, the old days, a whole school didn't need to be qualified. But the qualification, you don't need to have the qualification to start working as a SENDCO, but you have to be signed on to be studying the qualification, because you can't actually complete the qualification unless you're doing a lot of the SENDCO work. And particularly if you're a small primary school, you couldn't have somebody just shadowing somebody for that. You wouldn't have the staffing capacity. So you could be signed as a SENCO and be studying for your qualification or having your qualification.
That's good to know, because when you were explaining about the role, you mentioned a lot about kind of legal responsibilities, and I just it's just good to know that actually that isn't something that people are expected to pick up on the job. That it is you're taught it in the same way that we learn other skills. Thank you, because that's helped me to understand the role a little bit better.
No problem.
Also, and again, this might be my ignorance coming through, but is it usual for a SENCO to also be teaching at the same time? Because I imagine being a SENCO is a very demanding role. In that role, do you have to juggle being a SENCO and a teaching load?
Yes, most SENCOs teach, particularly primary SENCOs. They'll have some release time, and every SENCO will tell you they haven't got enough. When I was finishing as a SENCO, because the school I was in was so big, I actually didn't have a teaching commitment, but I did have lots of additional. I wasn't just a SENCO; I was an assistant head teacher, and I picked up a lot of other issues. And although I wasn't directly teaching, I had a lot of time that I was in classrooms, delivering, teaching, removal, groups, etc. But most schools, certainly the smaller the school, the more likely the SENCO is to have a teaching commitment and thus have a short period of time that they are doing that. And I would recommend if a listener is needing regular contact with a SENCO, they just have that little chat of when is your release time, because it can be very frustrating trying to get hold and get an answer, and the teachers got a full day teaching, their SENCO days on a different day. And if you know that their SENCO days are maybe a Monday whole day and a Thursday afternoon, that would be the better time to try and communicate, or to make sure you're free to attend meetings that you need to. That can be helpful.
That's a nice piece of advice, that to kind of stop minor frustrations that could be so easily resolved with a little bit of communication and planning. Thank you. So if parents feel that their child should be on the SEN register and isn't, is this something that they should speak to the SENCO about?
Most definitely. But the first place I would say is a class teacher in a
Okay.
primary school, because the class teacher will be seeing that child in a classroom learning environment, and children can present very differently at home and school, with learning, etc. Some have very clear partitions on what they can do, etc. So explaining to the teacher in the first state what you're seeing and what your concerns are, and then if with that teacher, that teacher should be talking to the SENCO about the children, that in their class they've got concerns about. It shouldn't be a knee-jerk response going straight onto the SEN register.
Right.
If you've got a child who is struggling in an area, it could just be that that's one skill that they're struggling, they've missed out one of the building blocks for that skill, etc. And there needs to be a process of just trying to see to adjust that, look over time and monitor it. Because for it to be a SEND and for a child to be put on the SEND register, that issue needs to be long term. It can't just be, this week they had a problem with their spellings and they were getting B's and D's a bit muddled up. They must be dyslexic. No, it's not as simple as that. So start with your teacher, have that concern. If you feel your teacher's not taking it seriously, or your teacher's echoing your concerns, things like that, it's then good to start going to the SENCO. But if everyone went to the SENCO with every time a spelling was wrong or something like that, you wouldn't get the time with the SENCO you need. So your teacher knows the child first, that learning environment. So I would start there.
Yeah. Well, I was actually thinking about because we want to focus quite a bit on the EHCPs, don't we, in this session? So I was just thinking as you're talking about that, about if a parent has a child who already has a recognised special educational need and they've got some support in school, there comes a point potentially in some cases where they have to consider whether an EHCP might be the next stage and whether that's appropriate. And I suppose the question might be, what from your point of view, when would you advise that a parent or maybe a school might think actually an EHCP is something we need to think about now because the SEND support that we're giving at the moment isn't perhaps working enough?
I think that's a brilliant question, and I first want to tell people that we're recording this in April 2025 because the SEND system and the EHCP system is broken. The government's admitted it. It's putting councils into bankruptcy. There's lots of issues. There's been green papers. There's lots of work. And what we're saying now, in a year's time, things could be in a different place. So it's probably still going to be relevant, but please do bear in mind when we're recording this.
Yeah, good point.
So when they created EHCPs, it was they got statements and they did a review of how well has creating SEND worked and what were the issues. And Woodcock did some research as a person who originally set up the SEND, and she went back in, did some research, and then somehow, from what she recommended and being told that that was all going to be accepted, what was delivered looked almost completely different and created many issues that they're trying now to address. But one of the big issues is every local authority can do it differently. And that's a big thing that people need to change. The reason why that's important is claiming an EHCP, getting an EHCP, the official point that a school looks at an EHCP is to meet the needs of that child is costing more than £6,000. Now, in some local authorities, £6,000 would give you 8 hours of in-classroom support. In other local authorities that are poorer, that would give you 15 hours of in-class support. And if your school was anything like my last school, I had children with EHCPs from 6 different counties. Each one of them had a different threshold for what I was legally supposed to supply with £6,000. So you do have a local officer that all your council has to have, and every council has to have on their website, and the schools, and that gives you a rough idea around those sort of things. But the official line is to meet the child's needs, costing more than £6,000. But it's not quite as simple as that, because often in primary school it can be easier to meet a lot of children's needs because they have less transitions necessarily. They've got one teacher for most of the lessons, not all. They're less moving around. The teacher will have known them and built that relationship longer. Going into secondary school can be a big bump, but secondary schools can sometimes have greater resources. I would suggest that if you're thinking your child would need an EHCP to manage secondary school, you need to be looking to apply in year 5 at the beginning of year 5.
Right.
And we get a lot, both as council, and I got it as a SENDCO in secondary schools. Primary schools didn't apply because I said we could meet the need within the 6,000. We knew they couldn't cope in secondary, but that's now your problem.
Yeah.
And that's partly because the primary school don't have the resources to apply for an EHCP for everyone. That £6,000 is just covering the legally, the support, the reasonable adjustments. As soon as you've got the EHCP and you've got the legal meetings, the admin, the workload that goes with it, as I said, I had over 50 in my last school, which was 2 annual reviews a week, rewriting 2 plans a week for these kids, collecting all that information. It becomes a workload issue. The reason we say the start of year 5 is legally, the legal time frame for an EHCP is 20 weeks. A lot of the time that cannot be met, and partly was because 20 weeks was, looking at things in good weather when they came up with 20 weeks. Partly is just how overwhelmed the system is. There isn't enough educational psychologists. There isn't enough, the assessment people. Most councils have had massive increases on EHCP applications, just the process of running through it, getting through the people that you need to write the plans. And if you think about something, when you're creating a legal document, somebody in my state, and I get the information, halfway through this process, and I might have 2-3 weeks to create a legal document for 4, 5, 10 kids. That's not a lot of time to do it in. So if you start at the year 5, you will definitely get it done by the end of year 5. And I would say that I would rather, me as a parent, I'd rather that the EHCP process took 30 weeks and the plan represented my child than I had a counsellor, somebody trying to hit a target, rushing it through 20 weeks. I look at it and go, but that's not my child, but they had to finalise it. As soon as you reach year 6, everyone in the council who works in SEND is instantly then trying to get these year 6 SEND children into high school places. And that happens before the non-EHCP children. So we start sending off all the plans in September, and we have until February to get them all signed off, so that the other children get their places. So if you waited till the start of September, year 6, to apply for an EHCP, you're not going to have the plan written to then apply for a place. And a lot of those places, those right schools might be mixed up. So if you are looking at it and you're thinking about it, then I would say year 5 is if you think they need it for the secondary school. And have that frank conversation with your primary school SENDCO. This is what I think. A lot of people think that only the schools can apply for an EHCP, but any professional or parent can ask for an assessment. If, as an adopted parent, you have a child and you think, they need an EHCP, you're not going to be able to provide that evidence by yourself, but you can kind of hold people's arms behind their backs to keep it in balance. So if everyone's saying, they might need it by secondary school, and you're thinking, okay, I want to go down this process, you can tell your SENDCO, if either you apply at the start of year 5, or I'm going to apply before Christmas year 5, and give the school time to get the evidence. Because the worst thing is, you apply, the school can't provide the evidence, and it gets turned down, and you're waiting for it to restart. But you can actually do that application. So if you are thinking about going for one, that's how and when you can just write off your letter, ask for that assessment.
Can I just jump in there? So, because I was going to ask whether you think it's a good thing that parents do apply themselves, or whether it's best left in the hands of the professionals. And you've obviously indicated there that you do think it's a good thing that parents apply. But I just need to be clear: if parents apply, at some point the school is still going to have to put forward their evidence, aren't they?
Yeah,
that's
so
right. So it's still working in conjunction with them.
Yeah, you don't want to be in a situation where you're saying one thing and the school's saying the other. And the school should. I don't know anyone who goes into teaching not wanting to do the best job for the children.
Yeah.
I do know lots of people who just don't have the time and resources to do what they would love to do. So they're doing a balancing act. Anyone who works in a school is. You could spend every day in a school and not get everything done throughout a year. Anyone who's been in there. I think parents applying is fine, but if a parent applies and the school is not at least aware or behind it, then the application is going to fail. And I can understand why primary schools, particularly smaller ones that are being overwhelmed, might struggle to process that application. So, this is where you want to be talking in year 4 and getting that evidence, because if the school can't provide the evidence, then it isn't going to go on to the assessment, and that's when the EPs are booked in, etc. By the time you've got to an EHCP, there should be a lot of evidence, because the school should have recognised at their SEND. They should have been doing plan, do, review is what the process is, where they say there's a need, they do a plan, they do it, they review, has it worked, do they need to do more of it, what do they need to change, and they go through cycles of this. And that's the evidence that the council will want to see before they say, okay, we're going to step this up to a legal document. And if that hasn't been done, it's a bit like if you've got a funny noise in your car, you'd want the mechanic to go and have a look at it before you just go and buy a new car for hundreds of thousands of pounds. And you don't want your child to have an EHCP unless they need one. More and more, particularly at post-16, we're seeing it hard to get some children with EHCPs into some college places because, again, they can't afford to do the admin. So EHCPs are for when it's a lot of money going in to meet those needs. It shouldn't be, they're SEN EHCP. It should be a small fraction of the EHCPs. You know, you can all think of the people who are laying in beds and can't move. They have them. The ones who need somebody super glued to them and going around. You know, these come in. If your child can manage without, try managing that out. What adaptations do you want? Because you want your child to be able to manage in the real world, in the real society. So going into the real world, the real society, those skills, they're what you learn in a normal secondary school, those dealing with those ups and downs, those little bumps, those meltdowns. And sometimes I think we can be a bit risk averse to allowing a child to do that. We want to just make it all nice. But then when they get 18 and they go into a pub, they haven't got those social skills or those knowledge skills. So, you know, it's not they're SEN, quick, chuck them in for an EHCP. Yeah, they're SEN. Okay, what can they do? What can we do just to make that a bit easier and give that person the skills that will make them more productive long term? And then an EHCP is when it's much higher than that, much more than that.
This is absolutely fascinating. And so, like, coming back a little bit then from the EHCPs, you know, what can we do to kind of like support them without taking that step towards applying? So this is where that phrase reasonable adjustments comes. Okay, what are reasonable adjustments? What can I, as a parent, reasonably accept or expect my child's school to adjust for her?
It's that there is in SEND, there's a load of words like inclusion and reasonable adjustments, which are horrible because they're really powerful words, but they're not clearly defined. You know, the government says everyone has to be inclusive, but won't tell you what it is.
Yeah.
So a reasonable adjustment is how you can make a difference to a child's learning environment without needing a large amount of resources, without being detrimental to the other children in the class. For me, reasonable adjustments is things like a child's got a hearing impairment or a visual impairment, sit at the front of the class in all their classes. It's a reasonable adjustment. It's not going to dramatically affect anyone else. It's going to make a massive difference to them. A child's autistic and having some sensory issues with a school jumper, the uniform issue is a bit relaxed. Yeah. And that's easier done in a small school than a big school, because, you know, everyone loves having, especially head teachers. Sorry, Jason. Everyone loves having all children looking identical in school uniform, and school uniforms do have a great place, but there needs to be that flexibility. Sometimes, like with medical, one I've dealt with going through reasonable adjustments is a school had a very strict healthy eating policy, but they had a diabetic who needed some high energy sugar, and they needed just those reasonable adjustments. That's not necessarily SEN, but it could rapidly turn into SEND. So reasonable adjustments are those small little adjustments that will make a massive difference to a child accessing education, where removing that disadvantage. They tend to be smaller, easier, but they are still a challenge for organisations to do. If you think about uniform or something like that, if every member of staff has been told to pick up on a child in uniform, you know, out of uniform, then every member of staff needs to know that child has a difference. And then you have to deal with the peer issues. Well, why are they allowed to do it and I'm not? Can be, you know, that child then feels, am I being singled out? So how do you make your uniform different at the same time of trying to get them used to professional clothing and make sure the uniform is safe? And how do you make sure every member of staff and that teacher who's just come in and has been told don't smile till Christmas and all the other rubbish that you shouldn't tell people, but they still come in saying it, that they're going to be the teacher that doesn't take any messing, and then suddenly they're singling out. So it is a challenge to do reasonable adjustments, but they do tend to be those small things. You're not bunging in a new lift. You're not, saying that this person's got one-to-one teacher with them the whole time.
Yeah.
I think I always liked is probably the wrong word here, but as a teacher, I was always more comfortable with the reasonable adjustments that I could plan for. So if it was different coloured overlay, if it was somewhere seated in the class, perhaps having an exit pass, changes the those kinds of things, I felt quite happy with, because I could write it down in my diary. I knew which child needed what, and that was all right. I think a lot of our children are often on the SEN register for social, emotional, and mental health difficult. And I think sometimes reasonable adjustments is harder to pinpoint there when the issues are perhaps not as easily solved. And I think a lot of people jump to, but they need an adult with them all the time. and that's not a reasonable adjustment, isn't it? And I just wanted to highlight that, because some reasonable adjustments are really easy and some I think are a little bit more vague and complex. And
I would really, with the adult touch somebody all the time, I'd also say that is quite that can be quite a negative to learning.
Yeah.
Because you would expect somebody who had SEN to have a little bit more teacher time, reasonable adjustment. They get checked, half as often as somebody who doesn't. But as soon as you bung another adult with them, that adult who isn't a teacher, who doesn't have those teaching qualifications, the teachers tend to spend less time with them, because there's all these people without adults shouting for their attention. And I also had parents who would come in around about January in tears because their kid, they were told, well, this is what we do for reasonable adjustments at these outstanding schools they've fought to get their kid into. If that doesn't match it, take your kid elsewhere, because we can fill your space with 5 or 6 other kids. And I don't think it's been done on purpose, things like that. But when you start looking for, particularly I'd say after the COVID and things like that, those low-level disruptions, those children with ADHD or having a little meltdown and things like that, that can easily cause a lot of disruption to other learners, etc. And if you've got a school that's just trying to climb to the head of some sort of league table or something like that, these are not the children you want. I hate to say it. And it's people's, it can be head teachers' jobs, etc. If you're a school that's failed and you've got to noticeably improve, the quick way is to not take these children that take a lot of resources, can disrupt others, and just try and get a cohort that's very identical and similar, that doesn't need a lot of change, doesn't need individualization. There may be key things in there, particularly around safeguarding, but I wouldn't make a decision on Ofsted, and I really wouldn't say just go for an outstanding school. I really wouldn't. I would be looking that you could see children with your child's needs being managed well in that environment and being wanted there. Because the worst thing for some of the children that we took in partway through the year, one of the issues being such a big schools, we did take in so many, is when a child feels that they're not wanted somewhere, that they're being, they're just a pain. When it's issues they can't do. So a place where a child is wanted, celebrated, not separated, not, we keep it all out there so no one else can see. I used to love getting, my autistic children, they did some wonderful slide assemblies with slides on what it's like to be me, because every autistic's different. So their mates knew that they wouldn't get that joke and they might respond that way. If you've got these needs, it shouldn't be an issue and everyone should know positively. So if you have got a child, particularly if they're at that EHCP level and you're looking at that secondary school, really go there and go, can I see my kid? And just ask, can you go and just see it? I always recommend new parents came to see me at break time, because I said, you'll see it as chaotic as it is, and you'll see how we make it safe. And we will have meltdowns, because your child needs to know how to handle a meltdown safely. and we need to push that envelope. We will have this, we will have that. Come and see if your child can be safe. But Ofsted hasn't always, depending on which Ofsted inspector you get, it's not always been prioritised. And your quick route to getting a successful school has always been get as a little change as possible, everyone having a regime one way.
Yeah, I just had a question back on the EHCPs again, which was about quite often the parents I find them supporting are struggling to know what to put on their application, because they do write some comments about their child, but they're kind of wondering what the kind of language they need to use, because they know their children very well, but it's making sure that they, from my point of view, I was trying to say to them, well, it's about trying to paint a picture of your child. What are their needs and how they manifest themselves? And I suppose when you receive and see these plans, what kind of language do you think a parent should be trying to use to help their part of the application seem really clear?
Yeah, it is a challenge, and I would say you did the right bit there by saying paint the picture of your child. You as a parent will know your child the best, and you'll know them in a different situation to the professionals. So quite a few children can be very in control, over in control of themselves with an academic or a professional coming in, and then they come home and they just let it all out, etc.
Yeah.
So being honest, just honest with your language, clear what they are. If it needs to be changed or altered, trust your writer to do that. If you want to have a chat with your writer because you're worried about the language, then say, don't try to phone us up because we'll be writing 20 plans, but send an email or something saying, at some point, write on it. At some point, I'd like to talk this through with somebody. If you've got a good writer and there is staff there, they should be listening to that, but and try and give you a call. And that's often a brilliant way of doing it. You do get to see the draft, so you can ask for corrections. They're not going. I'm not going to take, as somebody who writes a plan, I'm not going to take any diagnostic information from a parent, etc., because you're not got the qualifications unless you're very rare. You're somebody like me with one. But even if you do, I wouldn't want to give a diagnostic of my child because I'm too emotionally involved with that child. That's where we trust the professionals. So don't worry too much about that. What you can do is give that real color in that picture. What is their personality like? And use the words that you're comfortable with, that they're comfortable with, because a plan, yes, it's a legal document, but that bit where your information goes in as a parent, that's a bit that allows a future school, a SENDCO, or anything to go, okay, what's Billy, Bob, or whoever actually like?
Yeah.
And I think it's a key bit. It should be a thread going all the way through. So don't shy away from it. The only thing I would say is you don't want to include what they did 10 years ago. Yeah, your child will have a right to access this information at some point, and it gets edited and everything, but it tends to only get edited about every 3 years. So you're looking at stuff that's a good solid trend, not something like last week they picked the nose, so I'm going to write they're a nose picker or something.
Yeah.
You're more sort of like, they've always shied away from loud noises, but they love creating them, especially banging things together, things like that, where someone goes, okay, what am I doing with this child? And you'll find that that's then put into language as well by the educational psychologist, because they will talk to the parent and then they will try and professionalize that language of any diagnostic, any official terms. So don't go Googling terms or something, because that's when we can lose a child. Go for what's your heart saying, go for that picture. So when you read it, you're going, that's my child. And don't over egg things, but don't be afraid to put it down as them on their worst day and them on their best day. Yeah. And you can say that on their worst day, they are X, Y, Z. On their best day, they are, and that you get that picture then that's really important to the teachers who are going to use that plan.
That's really interesting, because I've always kind of spoken about, put on their worst day and don't be afraid to say that. But actually, if we are to know the child, knowing them on their best day as well is really important, isn't it? Because not every day is their worst.
No. and often for a professional, and it can just be they could have gone through 8 different professionals, teachers who are really brilliant, but that ninth one looks at something about them on the best days and goes, "Oh, that's the thing that suits." We've identified something there. That's why that's the best day that the others haven't been able to. If I know a kid really gets soothed by having a tractor, it's easy to bung it. Even as a secondary school teacher, I can bung a poster with a tractor on my wall. I could call it engineering, literacy, whatever I put on it. I could just put up that poster, and suddenly reasonable adjustment. Helping everyone. And what I've tried to do is said, that's them on their best day. How can I create more of their best day? And I need to know what that looks like. Yeah. And I think it can be such a battle getting to this point. Parents are so frustrated, and you get a lot of and that force. If you're at the point where you're supplying that information, then that's a bit to just take that step back and maybe do them as 2 separate ones. Do that whole angst. Well, then the worst day, you don't understand what I'm having to deal with, etc. That we get a lot of, but also but when we get it right,
this is what it looks like.
Yeah,
this is what it looks like, because that's what a school's going to want.
Yeah.
It's a strength, isn't it, that you put in there, that the things that you're going to need to use to build on, because he's building the child's strength in order to help them with the things that they're struggling with.
And often it's the parents who are best, because when we do an EHCP, you do strengths and then needs, and we all focus on needs and we all focus on provision, but the strengths are often a really key bit to a new teacher taking on a child. Okay, I've got a child and they're really struggling. Can I make my first couple of lessons focus on their strengths and make them settle, feel they can do before I bung in those challenges? And, they are really, really important, and often they come strongest from the parent.
Brilliant.
Thank you. Well, I know we're kind of getting towards the end of our time, and so I'm going to ask you quite an open question now, which is there anything that you would kind of want to share with the people listening that we've not covered? Is there any kind of really, you think, gosh, I wish they'd asked me this question. I don't want to dictate what you might think is important. You've got far more experience than me in this area.
I think there's a couple of bits that I think are really important for people who've adopted with children with SEND. And one is about diagnosis. Often you'd think that a child who's been in the system would be easier to get a diagnosis, for example, like an ASD diagnosis. But actually, a child who's been through social care can be a lot more challenging to diagnose. And the reason is, if I go through my checklist for autism, not making eye contact, being quiet, having meltdowns, wanting everything regimented in order that they can control, not understanding jokes and things like that. I then go through my checklist on my other side for safeguarding of a child who's been sexually abused or violently abused, and they would avoid eye contact. They'd want to control things. They might not to get involved in conversations or jokes because they've been literally the punchline of them in the past, etc. And unpicking, okay, is that an autistic need? Is it a experience generated need, or is it the fact that when they were a child they had something missing in their nurture? They all would require SEND, but actually bunging that label on it can be a challenge. And sometimes I have these conversations with social workers all the time of why I've had children who are less clearly autistic that have gone through the system quicker. It is terrible if you get something like a wrong diagnosis. Yeah. Don't try and look for labels. Don't try and look for names. When you go through a plan, are the needs of your child? Doesn't matter what causes them. Are they the needs of your child? We can work out the bit behind later. Are they the needs? Are they the strengths? Is that provision what will help your child? Don't try and jump for the labels. And it's useful, I know, when you can just say, oh, my child's this, my child's that. But it can lead to misdiagnosis. You don't want your child on medication that doesn't suit them, or taking any medication unless they really, really need it. You look at those long terms. Naming a school can take a long time. So even when you get a plan written, the people who write a plan, they have to send off the draft plan off to schools who have 15 days to respond. And bear in mind, we've only got 20 weeks. So you're sending them off, and you're not allowed to just send them off to every school because of GDPR. So they've got to be targeted. So finding a school can be a challenge, and you do need an EHCP if you're going to go for a special school. Again, if your child can survive in a mainstream school, they're going to find life working in the normal world a bit easier, because a mainstream school better represents what the real world they'd be going into. A special needs school, colleges do great picking them up, but it's a bigger jump. And some of these schools charge exorbitant rates. I wouldn't be telling a lie if I didn't say that I've got kids into schools which are charging £300,000 a year, and I'm having to pay £50,000 a year in taxi, and and you get having to outbid, even though I'm in the Midlands, that 300,000. The other child trying to get the same place came from Kent. And they were talking about doing that. There isn't enough special needs school places. They can't hold down the use of using private schools, and they will offer the world a lot of them. What you want to do if you're looking at a special needs school, anything like that, is where you're going to take my child. Not is my child going to sit there, be happy and comfy, because your child sitting there being happy and comfy will last for 2 or 3 years. Is my child going to leave with qualifications and able to work in the real world? What's your exit strategy as a special needs school? Because you can get, through tribunals, etc., forced to putting children into schools that you're thinking, is that really the right place? But I need to find a school place for this child. Right. So doing everything early, really thinking, and give mainstream a go. I think mainstreams can do a lot if they're protected from Ofsted. In doing so, they can do a lot if they've got your support. If they do need a special school, great. Go for the right one. Go and look. Don't just look for hollow promises. Again, make sure you can see your child there, and you can see how your child's going to be when they leave. What is their exit strategy for a special school? Would they look at trying to get them back into mainstream? Do they work with colleges? How are they going to make that jump in 5 years' time? How are they going to support that? I think that's really key, that we're not just looking. If your child, particularly if they're aggressive and they're violent and stuff, it can be very much, what do I do to get through 24 hours? I think every parent has that. When you're feeling in a good place and you've had a good day and everything's good, try and look at the other end, so that you haven't then got you're not trying to deal with stuff that could have been supported your child at the age of 11, 12, 13 with skills, but you're trying to deal with it with a 16, 17, 18-year-old, which is a lot more challenging.
I think that's such valuable advice, actually, because I know from my own personal experience and a number of people that I work with, quite often all the focus is on how do we solve the problem that we're having at the moment, that they are not feeling safe in school, that they cannot cope in school, that they need to have somewhere to go, or they need more support. How do we solve this problem? And it's kind of opened my eyes to actually thinking we can't be solving a problem if we haven't also got an eye on where this is going to lead in the future. And so much of what you've said today is about having that, like you say, on a good day when you've got the capacity to do it, have that plan of when do we start talking to teachers to get evidence, when do we start applying, so that we can apply for school places, and what's it going to look like when they're 16, 17, 18? What's the exit strategy? That's so important.
I always said to every parent coming in who will send, I said, you're thinking of your 11-year-old, how they're going to manage today. I said, I'm thinking in 5 years' time, how will your child survive going into a pub, having an argument, and not getting stabbed? That's my starting point. We can then work on jobs and building and everything like that, but we need to be on that route, because unfortunately that's part of today's society, and those issues with pubs and alcohol and things like that. As soon as you reach secondary, it's not long that you're there, and exams take out 2 years, so you've got 3 years to build up that emotional literacy, that sense, and that means you do need to have those points where you can push a child to have a challenge, not just wrapping up in cotton wool. You do need to have that relationship with the child. You do need to have, I always had an open door policy. We're not saying from day one you're going straight in, but you do need to take that child on a journey of, okay, where are we going? So they're not adult reliant, etc. So I do think that's something you do need to think about in the modern world is where they're going, because the other option is they're locked in, they end up locked, housebound. For me, I had a child who I was picking up from home to bring to do his exams because he was too scared to come in at the time to do exams. And this was middle inner city school. And he said to me, the issue is the gangs own his street. And he says, all my time at your school, I've always been told to say no to gangs and everything like that. My gangs own my street. I can't walk to my shop without passing the gang members, etc. You don't tell me how to manage that. You don't tell me how to day by day interact with gangs to keep myself safe. You're telling me to say no. You're telling me to lock my front door and never leave my house.
Mm.
And I thought, okay, we do need, particularly for those SEN children who are so vulnerable and can be so taken in, we do need to give them those wider skills. We can't just pretend that doesn't exist. Which I think society, we like a black and white, and
Yeah.
it isn't for these children who are living it. It really isn't. And we do need to give them those skills, and we have a short window to do it in secondary schools. That's me putting my secondary school hat on. But I do think, if your child is entering year one, having that sort of like that plan, okay, yeah, we're going to, we know that they have some SEMH issues. We're going to obviously want them to have the best future. So the best chance getting a good range of qualifications is mainstream. So how are we going to give our child those experiences and let them make mistakes and let them have meltdowns, and occasionally it will be a little scrap or something, unfortunately, but let them learn those skills so they can manage that secondary? Or are we just saying now, actually, we're going to wrap up in cotton wool, we're going to make sure they never go outside where they could have a fight with somebody, they could never do this, they've got somebody over them the whole time, and then we're just saying that actually secondary is not suitable now? And if we are, because some children unfortunately do end up on that pathway, okay, then what are we going to do to get them out of that SEN secondary school? But if you can start in year one, going, okay, this is when my child's struggling, building those emotional stepways to learning those skills. If you can start it then, it's much easier than waiting till they're 10 or they're 14 to try and do it.
Thank you so much for coming to join us
No
today.
problem.
It's been, I have found it, I think I've said the word fascinating several times.
Yeah,
I
it's
have
been such a
found it
wide-ranging conversation, hasn't
absolutely
it?
fascinating.
It's gone down directions I was like, oh yes, that's something
Yeah.
I hadn't expected. That's
Yeah.
really, really good.
It's been brilliant.
That's it for this episode. Huge thanks to Raun for joining us and sharing such thoughtful insights. We hope today's conversation helped demystify the role of the SENDCO and gave you some practical ideas for working with schools and navigating the EHCP process. If you found this episode helpful, don't forget to leave a review and share it with anyone who might benefit. And as always, we'd love to hear from you, whether you've got questions, stories, or topics you'd like us to cover in future episodes. Thanks for listening.